Before Alice Paul was born, there was a group of women who fought for equality. Susan B. Anthony was one of these women, and she helped to create the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention took place in 1848 and was the first convention that gave awareness about women's rights and the right to vote. The convention was full of discussions and lectures about women's role in society and the importance of equal rights for women. Alice Paul was born on January 11, 1885 to a Quaker family, believing that all women and men are equal. When she left the Quaker village, she realized that society was not set up this way. This inspired Alice to devote her life for fighting for women's rights, specifically the right to vote. Alice Paul joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association and was promoted to the head of the Congressional Committee. Alice Paul's attempt to getting women the right to vote was different from the National American Women's Suffrage Association because Alice was assertive and proactive in her approach. Alice and her colleagues, one in particular, Lucy Burns, went to Washington, D.C. and formed a suffrage parade to get the word out about women wanting the right to vote. During the parade, men who were watching got out of control and started screaming and yelling rude comments at the women. When the women ignored the rude comments, the men started to get physically confrontational and tried to ruin the parade. The parade took place on March 3, 1913, the day of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. This gave the women the public exposure they needed. They even were in the newspaper. After Alice Paul was in the newspaper for the parade, the National American Women's Suffrage Association decided that Alice Paul and Lucy Burns will not be on their committee anymore. So, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns founded the National Women's Party, which focused on getting the public support for women's right to vote. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns came up with a brilliant idea to protest in front of the White House, to make President Wilson aware of their cause. The National Women's Party members went to protest in front of the White House no matter the weather, rain or shine, cold or hot. The National Women's Party protesters held signs that said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" The protesters were protesting peacefully for about a week, when one day, the men who were walking by started to pull and rip the National Women's Party signs down and pushed the women to the ground. The police were called to the scene, and the women who were protesting that day were arrested. Alice Paul was not protesting that day, but she said that since all her colleagues that were protesting were thrown in jail, that she should go to jail too. The next day, she went to protest. The men did the same thing, and she was arrested too. The women were arrested in a workhouse in Washington, D.C. The women were put to trial and charged with obstructing traffic on a sidewalk. This was a very controversial ruling. The National Women's Party and lots of other supporters believed their imprisonment was for their political beliefs. A movie production company created the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, a historical film to show the importance of Alice Paul on the women's suffrage movement. It also gave clear visuals of the force feeding and how Alice was treated in jail. The following video may be disturbing to some viewers, but is a clear representation of the inhumane treatment Alice Paul was subjected to while she was in prison.
hunger strike.
A hunger strike was a radical way to take a political stand and definitely not appreciated by prison officials.
By my window,
The
a
song Will the
love
Circle Be Unbroken that is
broken
played during this movie is
by
sentimental because the National Women's Party members who are singing the song are referring to Alice Paul as being their mother and leader through the women's suffrage movement.
for to carry my mother away. Will the circle be unbroken? Get her out of here. By and by, Lord, by and by.
After a couple days from the beginning of the hunger strike, Alice still refused to eat. So the prison doctors had to take her, strap her down, put a mechanism on her mouth called the iron jaw to pry her mouth open. Then they shoved a tube down her throat into her stomach and poured raw eggs down her throat. Since she refused to eat, they had to resort to the horrible treatment. The public was informed about the inhumane treatment of the imprisoned suffragists. The press put pressure on President Wilson to release the women and give women the right to vote. Women who agreed with Alice Paul's cause helped put pressure on the government by continuing to protest. Later that year, President Wilson finally made the decision to release Alice Paul and the other imprisoned suffragists. But the fight for the right was not over yet. The National Women's Party needed 36 states to vote for the constitutional amendment to make it official. Tennessee was the final and deciding state to amend the Constitution on August 26, 1920. The 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, became a constitutional law. The United States Court of Appeals declared the arrest of all 218 suffragists unconstitutional. Alice Paul fought for women's rights until she passed away in 1977. Alice Paul's perseverance and sacrifice of her freedom helped women's rights. Now, women all across the U.S. have the right to vote. I always feel the movement is sort of a mosaic. Each of us puts in one little stone, and then you get a great mosaic at the end. Without social activists like Alice Paul, we wouldn't have the influential women who helped to shape social policy and social justice.